Hello, I hope this finds you well. Today I'm going to be talking to you about church in a changing world. Now, even just those words, a changing world, might bring up very different thoughts and feelings in people listening to this now. If you've grown up around or been around Christian cultures that have encouraged sort of us and them and have lent into maybe sort of fear-based religion and maybe fearing new things, seeing the older way of doing things being more godly and new changing things is something to be very cautious of um, and careful to avoid, then I can imagine talking about the changing world is not a comfortable feeling. You might have been around environments, and I certainly heard a lot of this growing up and continuing in countries that have been traditionally sort of Christian and had a lot of that in their framework, movements towards changing that, may sometimes be more inclusive, separate the whole sort of separation of church and state sort of idea. Sometimes those have been framed as attacks on Christianity and attacks on Christians. So it can always create this sort of persecution feeling. And if you've been around that sort of commentary from the believers or being taught in the pulpit, again, talking about a changing world, might make you feel very cautious and concerned. If that is you, I would really encourage this time as you go through a load of information, parts of the Bible, exploring things, to just take a deep breath and just try and be as open as possible. We all carry our life experience, the things we've been around with us, and sometimes when we face things, those are the lenses that we look through. And I just encourage for a wide variety of people, whatever you have experienced, but especially if you have been around that sort of commentary in the past and those feelings, particularly feelings of fear, to just try and lay those down and just be open, almost like you're just coming in contact with Christianity and the idea of church for the first time. Okay, so our faith community has gone through a lot of changes in recent years. And if you're listening to this as someone who's part of that community, you'll know all about that. And you've also chosen to stick around, considering the changes and adaptations that we made, sort of connecting with technology, meeting together in ways that look a bit different from a lot of that more, I say traditional church, but obviously we go back to the church, look very different. I mean, traditional as in, in a more recent time frame, if we're talking about biblical times. Still of meeting together once a month in the morning, having meetings at smaller ones in the church building every Sunday afternoon, apart from the main one that Sunday morning, and then meeting in small groups in a variety of locations in different ways, including the church building and outside it. So we have adapted and done things slightly differently as we've sort of adapted to the changing world and going in a direction we feel God's been guiding us. So we'll get into some Bible verses in a moment, but I also just want to circle back to what we are coming to the table with already, as in the lenses that maybe we're looking at things through and putting those down. I haven't got time to go into maybe a load of key things which I think have come up a lot in more recent years and people might think of immediately as part of this changing world, but also our understandings on some of those. And I'm aware a number of people are working off certain interpretations and teachings which aren't really biblical. There's a lot of mixed messages and confusion. So again, this whole, it's heart of openness. I'd encourage that too, with maybe some of those those things that people might think about as a changing world, and what does church look like in that context, and who fits and who doesn't. I think personally we need to get rid of the idea of who fits and who doesn't, because who are we to say we can't put God in a box. And I'd also say be very wary of using certain lines from the Bible or certain interpretations of trying to do that. Right, so let's get into those Bible verses. We've already covered church as a body with many parts, and the different parts playing different roles. So we're focusing now on church in a changing world. So start off in Romans 12, verse 2. This is quite a well-known one. I'm going to read from the NIV. It says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." So that verse comes from a letter that Paul dictated that was sent to Christians in Rome. And there is things in here we can find relevant for us, but it's also important to consider the context it was written in, the people it was written to, and the environment and the culture they were in. Now, there are a lot of things that are quite different from Roman culture to like our then and our culture now. However, there were the things that remain the same, and certainly power dynamics and abuse of that. There's a lot of similarities, really. And this do not conform to the pattern of this world. So think of these negative patterns. Now, if you have been around any sort of us and them teaching and sort of fear-based religion, you might have always had that idea that anything outside of the church is bad, anything outside of like Christians is bad. And I certainly can reflect on times as a teenager where I was hearing that kind of thing being taught. But obviously we know in the world around us there is authentic love still. There is kindness and generosity coming from wholesome, authentic places. There is good in the world around us too, as well as the bad, okay, as well as the damaging, as well as the things that are destructive. And it's differentiating between that, and it's not black and white, and it's not us and them either. Also, we just need to be honest. These, as they say, the patterns of the world, but destructive, damaging patterns, we know that those regularly come up in faith communities, sadly. Unfortunately, some of the structures and how the power works, it can almost turbocharge those abuses at times, which is a sad reality. And so this idea that it's good or it's bad, it's us and it's them, I don't think that's what it's saying here, but I can see how these verses have been used to encourage that kind of thinking before. So this is about, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, and then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good and perfect, his good, pleasing and perfect will. So the Holy Spirit, there's also around here, I'll go to some verses soon, touching on that. But we have, I think I've described it before as like this inner sat nav. We have a connection to God, and we can seek God's guidance on everything. And I would encourage you, always do that. I think sometimes, and we might have been encouraged to do this as well previously, we can sometimes think we already have the right answer. Or we know, I think I should be doing this, and I think God would want me to do this. I really think it is important to take time out and pray and seek guidance, because we can't put God in a box. And as far as the big picture, we only ever get to see a tiny little bit in front of us. And therefore, like, who are we to say we know exactly how things should be, especially when you consider the variety of interpretations, the different things in Christian culture, the number of things that when I was younger, maybe I was taught and had to like break down and then realize like that's not even biblical. Oh my word. But I had people in authority much older than me. I had all these messages of things. And so, I mean, it's an awful lot of work to go through and fact check everything and go through that way. But I still would recommend it. But seeking God in everything, asking for God's guidance, relying on the Holy Spirit in everything is so important, especially for this reason. Let's now go to 1 Corinthians 2, starting partway through verse 10 until verse 12. This is another letter from Paul, but this time to the Corinthians. So the Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. For who knows a person's thoughts except their own spirit within them? In the same way, no one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. What we have received is not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, so that we may understand what God has freely given us. So it's relying on God's guidance, relying on the Holy Spirit. And I would encourage people not to fear and to be open. God can do amazing things, as we are well aware, and to be open to that and not closed off from that or from people or the world around us, I think is really important. Also, I said before about almost like litmus test of, is it loving God? Is it loving each other? I just want us to focus back in on that, particularly with this thought of church in a changing world. So if we go back to those verses that explain all that, we've got the famous ones in Matthew 22 verses 37 to 40. Again, I'll read from the NIV. It says, Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbour as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So many of us are familiar with the story of the Good Samaritan. It's a very well-known story. And this parable story that Jesus told, I've heard it retold a lot of times, but there's a little bit that comes before it's told, which is often missed out, understandably. But I want us to focus on it now because it really hones in on who is my neighbour. So I'm going to read from Luke chapter 10, and I'm also going to go from verse 29 to 37. And it starts to describe about an expert in the law. They stood up to test Jesus and ask questions, and ends up asking, and this is from verse 5, it says, but he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbour? So this, love your neighbour as yourself. Now verse 30. In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he travelled, came where the man was. And when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbour to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, go and do likewise. Hearing the story of the Good Samaritan now, I think just how controversial it was at the time can be lost on us because our cultural context is very different. To have had like the religious leader, and we might expect to help this person in need, ignoring them. But it's the marginalized outsider, the Samaritan, who shows mercy and shows love and is the hero of the story. It's the, well, unexpected for the people listening to it at the time. I remember as an expert in the law, I think he was asking these questions in the first place. And if you have ever been around any messaging comments or encouragement to have an us and them mentality, there's so many other examples, but this in particular, I think, points to not doing that and the importance of loving God and loving our neighbour and doing that in a changing world. So there's so many different ways we can show love, love in action, and it could be a practical need that you want to meet. It could be donating to a charity. It could be working in like official charitable things. It could be praying to be more aware of needs around you and looking at how you can work in those spaces and praying for guidance as well in how you might do that. It might be that you can see some things which aren't helping, which are not loving towards people, and figuring ways to start to change that at a root level. So that could be activism and advocacy. It could be trying to change policy things. It could be doing something to really, like you say, get at the roots of an issue, or it could be helping with dealing with an issue. It could be just befriending, spending a bit of time with somebody. It can look very, very, very different. Now, as a church community, we have our church building, which we rent out cheaply to the community to help feed into our local community there. Our whole model of not having that really large meeting once a month, along with those smaller meetings weekly, if people want to come to them, as well as the other ones. One of the reasons for that as well is to free up people and resources to invest in other things and to love each other and love God in those ways. And whether that is you want to, you could use the church building for a variety of activities which feed into that. If you have got any ideas, if you've got anything that's sort of like burning on your heart, please come and speak to us as a leadership team to help with supporting whatever that is. And it doesn't have to be, oh, I'm going to do this every week, I'm going to do this every month. It might just be a pop-up thing. It can be a one-off. But I just encourage this spirit of openness to God to be used in a variety of ways, openness to do things differently, as we say, like in a changing world, or even what we've been around, what we've experienced. We might think, oh, loving people looks like this, or this is the way you do that, and just being open to guidance from God to maybe be doing something a bit different. Thinking of church in a changing world, I can see why it can be daunting, as we've already sort of covered, but it's also really exciting. And God is bigger than all of this. And we can trust God, basically. We're not doing things in our own strength. So I'm going to leave some questions up, so feel free to pause in a moment when they pop up for you to go through if you're by yourself, just to reflect on individually. If you're going through this as a group, to maybe discuss if you feel comfortable doing so. And yes, I thank you for listening and joining in with this session today. Take care. Bye.